What if Kamala Harris had won the 2024 election? Today, we're turning back the clock a bit. It has officially been just over 1 year since Kamala Harris accepted the Democratic nomination for president at the 2024 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Fun fact, I was actually there at the beginning of the event. To prove it, here's a photo I took because I had a press credential and was allowed inside the arena. Just a little flex. But that's enough about me. I don't honestly even know why I shared that. It's no secret that Kamala Harris had a tall task jumping into the race for the presidency just a few months before the general election. In hindsight, it seemed fairly obvious that Donald Trump would win. He had nearly all of the momentum despite what polling numbers showed, and on election night that all came to fruition. As we all know, Trump took back the presidency by a total of 312 electoral votes to Harris's 226. It was a resounding victory for him, as he also won the popular vote, becoming the first Republican president to do so in 20 years. But what if he hadn't won at all? That's the premise for today's video, and on its surface it seems like a fairly simple one. But what truly would have happened had Harris won the presidency over the Donald last November? Today, I'm not only going to explore a scenario where Harris had won, but also recap much of what Trump has done during the first several months of his presidency, and see how Harris's policy would have differed from what we currently have in place. What would she have done first? How would the country have reacted? Would her presidency have been stuck in political gridlock? Before we get into all of that, be sure to hit that like button if you enjoyed today's video, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. Now let's dive a little bit more in depth into our change to recent history, the immediate aftermath of our altered election. Picture this, the date is November 5th, 2024, and polls are beginning to close across the east coast of the United States. Exit polling data shows a tight race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, much like everything we've seen in the build-up to this election, and early numbers coming in from across the country reflect that. You see, in our scenario today, Harris doesn't win in a landslide. She wins in an extremely tight race, albeit one that's able to be called the same night that the votes are being tallied. In our altered timeline, Kamala Harris hangs on tight to the swing states of the Rust Belt, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, while Trump, much like he did in real life, flips back 3 other swing states from blue to red in Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. The Rust Belt ultimately ends up deciding the entire election, with Harris winning 270 electoral votes to Trump's 268, making it an extremely tight race overall. She also narrowly wins the popular vote in our scenario, largely because we've never seen a Democratic nominee for president lose the popular vote yet win the Electoral College in modern US politics, outside of Bill Clinton, whose race was a very special case. Anyways, back to our scenario. The following morning, AP News and several other news outlets call the race for Harris. But even before that happens, Trump begins his election rigging rhetoric over on Truth Social, citing apparent illegal voting in cities like Philadelphia and Detroit. This strategy, unsurprisingly, echoes his 2020 election strategy, and the myriad of lawsuits from Trump that follow his loss to Harris in this timeline mirror his challenges in 2020 as well. With these lawsuits comes civil unrest, with thousands of Trump supporters gathering in cities where crucial Harris votes decided the race. Claims of undocumented migrants voting for Harris and flipping the race in her favor spread like wildfire on X, with Elon Musk amplifying many of the posts to his hundreds of millions of followers. All in all, it's a situation of extremely high tension, but it's also different from 2020, due in large part by the fact that Trump isn't the sitting president. As challenge after challenge from Trump and his team fail, and certification day and inauguration day inch closer, the Biden administration is determined to ensure that the events of January 6th do not come to fruition again. Eventually, certification day in DC arrives, and the security there is airtight, with thousands of National Guard troops deployed in and around the nation's capital. Ultimately, this staves off the worst of what many people might have been expecting, with protests remaining relatively quiet overall. By the end of the election's certification, 15 House Republicans and 3 senators, including J.D. Vance, object to the result, citing voting irregularities. Harris certifies her own victory, and on January 20th, 2025, she is inaugurated as the next president of the United States. With the baseline for this alternate scenario now set in stone, let's get into Harris's policy. What would she have done first as president? It's time to find out. Kamala Harris's first 100 days. Given that Kamala Harris was the vice president under Joe Biden, I think we can safely assume that much of her first 100 days in office would have been spent continuing much of Biden's agenda, albeit with a bit of a shift in both emphasis and branding. A Harris presidency almost certainly would have been seen by the public as Biden 2.0 in direction, but not necessarily in tone. Before we get into comparing how her plan would have compared to what Trump is actually doing now, let's quickly run through some of the biggest goals Harris would have tried to accomplish during her first 100 days as president. To begin, much of Harris's focus during her first 100 days would have been on economic relief. When she announced her economic plan in August 2024, she She planned an early push to combat price gouging, particularly on things like groceries. She also would have pushed to investigate things like supermarket mergers and, more generally, penalized bad actors in this area more harshly. Critics of these ideas claim they could be veering into the territory of price control, which could have set a risky precedent, though it's ultimately unclear whether that would have been the case or not. Continuing on with her economic relief plan, Harris's first 100 days likely would have seen a huge push to cap the cost of prescription drugs such as insulin, as well as more generally attempting to reduce the burden of medical debt on Americans by introducing policies to get rid of medical debt entirely. All in all, her economic plan for the first 100 days of her presidency would have been focused on reducing everyday costs for Americans. We'll get into the specifics of that, as well as how it would have differed from what Trump is currently doing in a few minutes. For now, let's talk about the rest of her 100-day plan. When it comes to housing, Harris proposed constructing 3 million new housing units over her 4 years as president under the Build the American Dream plan. Obviously, this would have been impossible to get done during her first 100 days, but it's very likely we would have seen some sort of legislation passed or worked on related to this early on in her presidency. Her housing plan also included offering up to $25,000 in down payment assistance for first-time homebuyers, particularly those who have paid rent on time for at least 2 years, with even more generous assistance for first-generation homebuyers. Once again, it's unlikely that this would have been entirely accomplished in her first 100 days, but it's something that would have been worked on. Meanwhile, on the topic of taxes, Harris's first 100 days would have had a few focuses, namely tax credits and relief as well as wealth equity measures. Legislation would have likely been started to push for a $6,000 first-year child tax credit and the elimination of income taxes on tips. Additionally, Harris wanted small businesses to enjoy tax deductions up to $50,000, encouraging entrepreneurship. The wealth equity portion of her tax plan would have likely taken much longer to get done than in her first 100 days, as her vision for this included a capital gains tax increase, a billionaire minimum income tax, increased buyback taxes, and even a potential tax on unrealized gains for ultra-wealthy Americans. Regardless, we may still have seen some movement to get the ball rolling on this front. Now let's get into a really hot topic, immigration. During her campaign, Harris admitted that the U.S. immigration system was broken and supported bipartisan expansion of Border Patrol agents. In her first 100 days, Harris likely would have pushed for Congress to pass the bipartisan border security bill that Republicans and Democrats drafted in mid-2024. The bill called for hiring thousands of new Border Patrol and immigration staff, streamlining case processing, and raising the bar for asylum claims in the U.S. If you remember correctly, Trump ultimately got GOP Congress members to shut this down. We'll talk more about how this all would have compared to what he's done so far in a bit. Before wrapping this section up, let's touch on foreign policy, specifically how Harris would have approached the war in Ukraine and the war between Israel and Hamas. On Ukraine, Harris repeatedly framed aid to the war-torn country as essential and rejected any land for peace deals. During her first 100 days, it was expected that she would have made an early push to move appropriated funds quickly for weapons to be sent to Ukraine and press Congress for any top-ups if needed. She also likely would have kept saying no to peace talks with Putin if Kiev didn't have a spot at the table as well. Meanwhile, on Israel and Hamas, she likely would have continued with Biden-era policy for the most part, but with a shift in her public tone. During her campaign, Harris consistently paired backing for Israel's defense with calls to end the war, free the hostages, and to expand humanitarian aid to the region. In practice, she likely would have maintained most military support to Israel while also signaling limits on specific munitions tied to civilian harm concerns, alongside robust aid into the Gaza Strip and West Bank. There also probably would have been a sharper emphasis on humanitarian outcomes in her public remarks. The last major emphasis of Harris's first 100 days would have been a continuation of Biden-era climate policy. There probably wouldn't have been too much legislation to work on here, at least right away, given that her focus would have been on maintaining clean energy. Regardless of that though, it still would have been something her administration tried to key in on. That's everything it seems like Kamala Harris would have worked on in her first 100 days had she actually won the presidency. But of course, that's not the reality we actually live in. So how does that compare to what Trump has actually done? Let's now go policy topic by policy topic and discover the true differences between the two sides. Trump's economics versus Harris's economics. As we've already somewhat established, Kamala Harris would have likely spent her first 100 days trying to pass direct economic relief for Americans. While Trump has also framed things like inflation as a kitchen table issue, he's leaned on different strategies to tackle the problem. To be more specific, President Trump has taken a supply-side approach to managing inflation rather than pursuing direct price controls or consumer cost caps. He previously signed executive actions aimed at unleashing American energy, declaring a national energy emergency to boost oil and gas production and bring down energy prices. At the same time, his administration enacted sweeping deregulation, targeting hundreds of regulations, particularly environmental rules that business officials say reduce costs. Trump's Office of Management and Budget projected this deregulation could yield up to $5 trillion in cost savings for businesses in 2026. However, other assessments claim that Trump's efforts could carry unintended consequences. For example, Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill actively reduces clean energy incentives and expands fossil fuel subsidies, potentially increasing household energy bills by an average of $165 to $270 annually and leading to $1.1 trillion in lost GDP GDP over the next decade, according to some estimates. Speaking of, let's talk more about the One Big Beautiful Bill, which was a key component of Trump's economic plan during the first 100 days of his presidency. Trump signed it into law on July 4th, 2025, and the tax policy in it marks one of the biggest contrasts to how things would have looked had Harris won the presidency, though there are a couple commonalities as well. For example, Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill effectively eliminated taxes on tips while also increasing the child tax credit. Harris's tax policy would have accomplished both of these, though she likely would have increased the child tax credit by even more than Trump did, and that's about where the similarities end between the two sides. Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill basically solidified his 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act into permanent law. That 2017 act lowered the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21% and trimmed individual tax rates across most income brackets. As I've already mentioned, it also expanded the child tax credit. Supporters argue these moves encourage business investment and boost growth, though critics argue they added trillions to the deficit and disproportionately benefited corporations and higher earners. Harris, meanwhile, would have had a different strategy. She emphasized a more redistributive approach, so to speak, calling to raise taxes on billionaires and capital gains while using the revenue to expand working family relief through the form of larger child tax credits, eliminating taxes on tips, and boosting small business deductions. In short, both aimed to give families more breathing room, but Trump leaned on across-the-board cuts to spur growth, while Harris's focus would have been on shifting the burden upward to deliver targeted relief to the middle class. The last thing to touch on before we wrap this section up is housing. Trump never really campaigned on a housing plan, but for Harris, it was a core part of her 2024 platform. We already touched on what her housing policy would have aimed to do, but Trump, by contrast, has not advanced a federal housing construction plan. Instead, his team has emphasized cutting regulations that they argue make it harder and more expensive to build houses. He has also supported scaling back some rental protections, aligning with a philosophy that if private markets are less restrictive, it will drive affordability in the housing market. All in all, the tone of how they presented their economic plans differed significantly too. Had Harris won, her emphasis for passing this legislation would have been on protecting families from exploitation and taking the stance of consumer protection. Instead, we now have Trump's angle of unleashing American industries, which we've seen in multiple of his executive orders. With all of that in mind, it's now time to shift gears to a different topic, immigration. How does what Trump has done so far compare to what Harris might have been doing on the issue? Let's get into it. Trump's immigration policy versus Harris's immigration policy. As we move into immigration, this is another area where Trump and Harris would have had just a tiny bit of overlap in rhetoric, but very different strategies in practice. Both talked about the system being broken, and both agreed that stronger enforcement at the border was necessary, albeit they communicated these points in very different ways. From there, though, their approaches would have started to diverge. To start with Trump, his second term has been extremely hardline on immigration. That shouldn't really be a secret to anyone at this point. His first days back in office included signing an executive order called Protecting the American People Against Invasion. This executive order set the tone for his immigration agenda by expanding expedited removals, penalizing sanctuary jurisdictions, and requiring undocumented individuals to register with federal authorities. Since that point, we've seen ICE raids in major cities across the United States, and his administration has launched high-profile operations like the Midway Blitz in Chicago on September 8th, which began targeting undocumented immigrants in the city regardless of whether they had a criminal record. He also overturned long-standing rules that had kept enforcement away from places like churches and hospitals, signaling a willingness to put aggressive enforcement above community protections. Harris, on the other hand, campaigned on passing a bipartisan border deal, as we've already discussed. That deal would have created more Border Patrol agents, asylum officers, and immigration judges with the goal of speeding up decisions and tightening credible fear screenings. Like Trump, she wanted to move faster on deporting people who didn't qualify for asylum, but she was clear that her method would have been through legislation and structured reform rather than sweeping executive orders. In that sense, the commonality is obvious, as both leaders thought that more enforcement resources were needed, but Trump has overwhelmingly leaned on executive power, while Harris probably would have leaned more on lawmaking. Trump's approach in this regard was also just more aggressive in general. Anyways, looking at status protections and asylum more specifically, Trump has moved to revoke temporary protected status for groups like Venezuelans and Haitians, which left hundreds of thousands in limbo before a judge blocked him from doing so. He also rolled back asylum eligibility, which removed protections for people fleeing domestic violence. In contrast, Kamala Harris was more likely to preserve protections for dreamers and farm workers while still raising the bar for certain asylum claims. During her campaign in 2024, she framed her approach as tightening the system without cutting it off entirely. Again, there's just a sliver of common ground here, but not much. Both Harris and Trump aimed to prevent abuse of the asylum process, but Trump leaned toward outright revocation, while Harris would have pursued incremental reform had she won the presidency. Finally, there's the broader community impact. Trump's actions have created waves of fear in immigrant-heavy cities, from sweeping ICE raids in Washington, D.C., to arrests of restaurant workers in questionable circumstances, to even more recently, the arrests of hundreds of Korean workers at a Hyundai car factory in Georgia. His administration also barred voter registration efforts at naturalization ceremonies, limiting civic participation for new citizens. Harris didn't campaign campaign on those specific issues, but her general tone while campaigning suggested she would have blended enforcement with a focus on protecting families and expanding citizenship opportunities. In other words, Trump has emphasized sovereignty and deterrence, while Harris would have aimed to pair security with a more humanitarian framework. All in all, both leaders recognized the challenges at the border, but they broke sharply from each other in how they balanced enforcement with protections. Trump's policies so far have leaned heavily on executive orders and crackdowns, but Harris likely would have focused more on legislation and maintaining certain safeguards. With immigration now covered, let's get into discussing how Harris might have differed from Trump on foreign policy. Trump's foreign policy versus Harris's foreign policy. When we look at foreign policy, the contrast between Trump's actions thus far and what Harris likely would have done couldn't be sharper. Both talked about American strength and global leadership, but they envisioned very different paths forward. Starting in Ukraine, Harris made it abundantly clear while campaigning she would have maintained or even expanded U.S. support until Ukraine could secure what she called a quote-unquote just peace. That meant continuing weapons shipments, bolstering NATO, and keeping pressure on Russia with sanctions. She framed it as not just aid, but as an investment in the rules-based international order. Trump, by contrast, has pushed Europe to shoulder more of the burden, pressuring NATO allies for contributions and suggesting U.S. aid could come with strings attached. He's also floated the possibility of peace talks that could involve territorial concessions from Ukraine. So while both say Ukraine's sovereignty matters, Harris would have leaned more into collective defense, while Trump has leaned more into conditional and transactional support. The Middle East brings the biggest and most dramatic differences here, though. During her campaign, Harris positioned herself as staunchly supportive of Israel's security, but she also repeatedly highlighted the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. She called for more aid, safe corridors, and a ceasefire for hostages deal that respected civilian lives. In a March 2024 speech, she demanded that Israel, quote, significantly increase the flow of aid, as well as open new crossings and ease unnecessary restrictions, warning that, quote, people in Gaza are starving and that, quote, conditions are inhumane. Later that summer, in comments following a meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, she acknowledged Israel's right to defend itself, but added, quote, how it does so matters, and emphasized that the suffering in Gaza must not be ignored. Trump, on the other hand, has pushed a 180-degree different vision. He publicly proposed that the US should, quote unquote, take over Gaza and transform it into a, quote, Riviera of the Middle East, rebuilding it as a tourism and high-tech hub with smart cities, resorts, and new jobs. His plan even included relocating the approximately 2 million Palestinians, supposedly voluntarily, in official phrasing, to neighboring countries or secured zones during the reconstruction, with token compensation and promises of new housing later. That vision sparked global outrage, with critics labeling it akin to ethnic cleansing and saying it violated international law. We even saw Palestinians themselves vowing to rebuild their homes and hotels on the Mediterranean coast in response. In short, both leaders claimed they'd support Israel, but Harris spoke far more of ending suffering and building durable peace with humanitarian concern at the center. Trump, on the other hand, speaks of sweeping remaking and control, with seemingly less regard for those directly affected. Finally, before we wrap up this section, let's look at alliances across the board. Harris would likely have leaned into traditional US roles like reinforcing NATO, deepening ties in Asia, and engaging multilateral institutions like the UN. Trump has done the opposite, consistently questioning the value of entities like NATO, favoring leader-to-leader deals, and using tariffs and leverage rather than coalition diplomacy, yet both presented themselves as defenders of American strength, Harris through gathering allies and reinforcing norms, and Trump through unilateral power and disrupting maneuvering. Had Kamala Harris won the presidency, US foreign policy might have looked significantly more centered on humanitarian concerns, alliance building, and a firm support for Ukraine and a two-state solution in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Instead, what we've seen from Trump has leaned toward transactional diplomacy, as well as America-first unilateralism, and even bold ideas like the remaking of Gaza into a Riviera. And with that, it's now time to move into the final policy section of today's video: Trump's social policy versus Harris's social policy. Before we wrap up this video, we absolutely have to touch on social policy. First up, abortion. On abortion, Harris campaigned on protecting reproductive rights nationwide. She pledged to push Congress to codify Roe v. Wade into federal law, and said she would veto any attempt at a national abortion ban, even calling for changes to Senate rules if necessary to get it done. Trump, by contrast, has treated the overturning of Roe as one of the major achievements of his presidency. After all, it was his Supreme Court picks that tipped the balance. In his current term, he has reinforced the Hyde Amendment by executive order, blocking federal funds from being used for most abortions and promoting state-level restrictions instead. Healthcare has also been a huge point of divergence. During her 2024 campaign, Harris emphasized affordability here, and even championed rules to wipe medical debt from credit reports, which was a policy that erased $49 billion in debt from about 15 million Americans that got announced in January of this year. She also helped direct federal funding through the American Rescue Plan to cancel billions of dollars in local medical debt while she was vice president. It's very likely her work in this area would have continued had she won. Trump, on the other hand, has pursued a rollback of parts of the Affordable Care Act, instructing agencies to expand waivers and exemptions as part of his broader push to reduce the federal role in healthcare. Civil rights and protections for LGBTQ+ Americans marks another clear split. Harris supported codifying non-discrimination through the Equality Act and oversaw federal rules protecting LGBTQ+ Americans in healthcare, education, and federally funded programs as vice president. Trump has taken a very different direction, rescinding protections for transgender individuals across federal agencies and removing gender-affirming care coverage for federal employees and their families. He has also revived some of the most controversial policies from his first administration. That included reinstating the ban on transgender individuals serving in the military, which was first implemented in 2017 and later rolled back under Biden. More recently, reports surfaced that his administration was even considering a policy to ban firearms sales to transgender Americans, a move that would create new restrictions based on gender identity and sparked fierce debate among both gun rights and LGBTQ+ advocacy groups. Even in education, the difference in emphasis is clear. Harris tied her agenda during her campaign to expanding early childhood education and supporting working families, as we've already touched on, while Trump has focused more on issues like expanding school choice and restricting what he called ideological curricula. He and his administration have also heavily pursued ridding public schools of alleged woke ideologies in their curriculum. Both frame their policies as pro-family, but Harris leaned on federal expansion of rights and services, while Trump leaned on state control and conservative cultural priorities. With all of that out of the way now, let's take a couple minutes to answer one final, very important question. Would Kamala Harris have been stuck in political gridlock? I'll just be straight up with you all. My quick answer to this question is probably, but let me explain why I think so. When Trump took back the presidency last November, it wasn't just a resounding victory for him, but a resounding victory for the Republican Party in general. We saw Republicans win majorities in both the Senate and the House, which basically meant that Trump had, and still has, free reign to try to pass whatever legislation he sees fit. I don't believe Kamala Harris would have been afforded the same opportunity. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, had she actually won the presidency, I believe the race would have been tight. I also think Democrats wouldn't have been able to hold on to the House. The Senate could have maybe remained split, but if we only flip the presidency in our timeline, that means that Harris would have been working alongside both a Republican Senate and a Republican House. In other words, that's pretty much guaranteed political gridlock. And given the backlash we probably would have seen from many Republicans had Trump lost again, my guess is the Republicans in Congress wouldn't have been too eager to work with her. So unless she tried to make some sort of huge compromise from the policy she ran on, I just don't know if she would have been super effective, at least early on. And that's not necessarily her fault at all. I'm just pointing out what I think would have happened. Anyways, that's all I've got for you today. I have no idea how this video got so long. I wanted to include a section in this video about their styles of governance, but after writing most of this script, I realized it really wasn't necessary, as their differences in governing seem pretty evident across all the major policy topics I talked about. If you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please feel free to like and subscribe. More videos coming soon. Also, I had a note about this at the beginning of the video, but YouTube is testing a new hype feature for small creators. If you're given the option to hype this video, please consider doing so. It apparently helps a ton to get my channel out there. If you're interested in learning more about anything I talked about today, feel free to check out my sources in the description down below. As always, thank you so much for watching and for your continued support. I really appreciate it. Hope I see you next time. Take care.